Hi everyone, my name is Joel Ruiz and I am posting my video rebuttal to the Israel Palestine question. Has the UN been fair to Israel? I posted that the UN has not been fair in their treatment to Israel. And before I dive a little bit into that, again, the background and the context of my history with Israel. I've become interested in the Israel Palestine conflict because of my work on campus at UC Santa Barbara in student government and the interest to divest from corporations that fund um, uh, that fund and support um, sorry that have ties to Israel. Um, and So, understanding the fact that they affected so much of our local economy and what our students' fees were going to, that really brought to light for me. It highlighted the fact that a lot of students didn't want their funds to go to Israel because of the fact that they believe that they committed atrocities and human rights violations, as seen in the UN, in the UN's eyes. And I just said that the UN has not been fair to Israel because of the fact that I went back to the history of the conflict and I focused on making it more of a focusing on a more of a territory and resource perspective. Especially in the Middle East, are many articles and talks about the resources in Palestine and Israel, and especially the water resources and the lack thereof. Um, and so I wanted to on it that way because I wanted to take away the religious perspective, which is also such a pressing issue. But it's so hard to deal with all the intersectionalities at once. So it's important to focus, I think, on these things that we can't control at the beginning. And so I focus on the history, and basically the blame goes and shifts back to the UK, and that promise to to themselves first to keep the land, some of the land um, that belonged to Palestine, um, to the promise to give some of the land to somebody. Um, I believe it was Mecca, the leader of Mecca at the time. Uh, and after that, they promised to give that land to Israel to establish a Jewish state. So what happened then is that initial conflict of a land issue, and I just wanted to follow that to focus on the fact that the UK, is to blame here when they shifted the responsibility to deal with the conflict to the United Nations, the newly established United Nations. Um, that was a terrible thing to do to a fertile um, a fetus of an idea that they wanted to create on an international scale. And now to this day it still haunts um, the United Nations. And the reason I say that it hasn't been fair, finally, is because of the fact that the United Nations failed. Though they were given rough circumstances, they failed to set the correct borders when they had the ability to. Instead, they decided to play politics. They decided to what amounted to a jigsaw puzzle when they split up the territory between Israel and Palestine. They decided there was going to be an Israel and a Palestine, and they failed to really set those lines. So that really, of course, led to conflict. It led to confusion, and what Israel's argument became was, well, we didn't know exactly what land was ours and what wasn't. And to their right, it is because of the lack of clarity there. So in that sense, no, the UN has not been fair in their treatment. Though there are many different perspectives here, and I focus on Kyle Fevish's perspective here because he did focus on the fact that the UN has been fair in its treatment of Israel, and he focuses on the treatment in terms of the sanctions and uh, the the reports that came out from the UN that I also mentioned in my report about Israel's war crimes, and the fact that Israel continues to take over much of the Palestinian territory. Um, and so I want to get into Kyle's argument just a little bit because he does focus on a little bit about his background and his background with the conflict, and he mentions that Israel is seen, and it's very true. I agree with Kyle in that sense. Israel is seen as needing to be protected, as because we need to pity Israel because they're a nation that is so fragile that came from the Holocaust. No, it's not true. It was long before the Holocaust. The Holocaust was just an effect. Um, and so he did point out that, he did have this sentiment to feel bad towards Israel. And I just wanted to argue that, he said that changed because he saw, well, no, they're committing atrocities, so I shouldn't feel bad for them. And just to argue and just to focus on that specifically, um, to withdraw that resentment can also psychologically lead to you subconsciously hating the actual subject more than you initially did because you feel like a fool for being drawn to pity them. And so there's that bias there in terms of maybe the UN should be more aggressive in pursuing Israel, and maybe they are right in saying that Israel is this atrocious nation and state. And so that is something that I wanted to point out. Of course, no disrespect, but it is something that to be conscious of because bias is something that will easily be torn apart. Um, and let's see, just checking my notes here. Also, I wanted to focus on the fact that the UN has focused a lot on Israel, and to that regard, they've lacked focusing on the United States and the atrocities that the United States continues to commit. They talk about the land that Israel continues to occupy in Palestine. However, the United States is the one supplying Israel with the weapons and the resources necessary to do this. And so, why is the United Nations not holding Israel and the United States accountable? Instead, they're using Israel as a scapegoat. So that really just also undermines their own authority. So in that regard, no, you cannot play against one player and pretend to have an even playing field. So I did want to focus on that, and yeah, that is my argument. I hope I covered all the bases. I wanted to again be respectful and just cover a good portion of the history and the learning that was covered here. So thank you.